here we go. So I won't give the opening speech again because it really wasn't worth recording, but suffice to say, I'm delighted that we've had so many people here. There's still people coming in the waiting room. Thank you very much for joining. I'm sure that this is not the last event we'll put forward. And I think Randy and I will have a conversation, and colleagues in the coming weeks, as to what we'll do from here. So I think it's going to be a tremendous event. I'm delighted that Talal Bond has agreed to sort of facilitate the conversation. And I'm going to just pass straight over to you now, Talal.
Thanks, Lawrence. My name is Talal Bond. I'm the immediate past president of Canadian Defence Lawyers. For those of you unfamiliar with our organization, we are the voice and resource for civil defense lawyers. We provide a national perspective, quality defense-specific education and networking opportunities. Our focus is providing education, advocacy, and opportunities for our members. We came to being in the 90s, and over the course of the life of CDL, there have been a lot of changes in the world. It's trite to say that changes occur, but there have been some very significant ones from a global perspective. Our members advise insurers, reinsurers, both regional and multinational insurance companies. And over the course of the past 25 plus years, we've seen significant changes to the markets in which we operate. Over that time, CDL started off from a small group, but has grown. We have long been an active partner in US organizations such as the Defense Research Institute, and many of our members individually belong to international organizations such as the IADC, ADTA, and of course FDCC. And I apologize if I missed any. Through those partnerships, we've managed to strengthen the quality of our bar. We are focused on maintaining high professional standards, and we're able to do so by liaising with our colleagues in different common law jurisdictions. As I was mentioning, in the past 25 years, we have faced very significant changes. We have faced accelerated globalization with its associated fallout, skewing of economic control, concentration of wealth, ownership, disparities in terms of income, and unfortunately, lagging and often disjunctive regulations. And this has led to our current climate of global instability. This instability reaches directly into the lives of ordinary people across the globe. And this type of change and the rapidity by which we are facing it is truly has never been experienced by global populations. We are also having to face with inexpert politicians of all varieties, and as they integrate into civic structures, seemingly promoted by shallow slogans, as if our anxieties could be allayed by simple solutions. But we know there are no simple solutions, and that the problems that we face are complex. They are complex. There's no easy way to get around it. When we look at these problems that we are facing, it's very difficult to try and understand our day-to-day activity, how we fit in terms of providing advice to our clients, and yet the landscape changing so quickly. We know that the world is in crisis, but we have to, as an organization, as CDL, look for the opportunity in the crisis. And we recognize that those new challenges have to be addressed by the executive of CDL insofar as our mandate permits. And one of the initiatives that we came up with was to expand our global connections with similar organizations, such as Forum of Insurance Lawyers, which is a UK-based organization and is very active in UK and in Ireland. FOIL is the representative voice of the defendant insurance lawyer community, and it advances a reforming agenda for more transparent and proportionate claims environment benefiting claimants and insurers alike. Their foundation of their organization is essentially identical to ours: education, advocacy, and networking. In the past months, we've met with our counterparts at FOIL, and we've identified most pressing shared issues. The issue that we're going to speak about today is so significant that it's palpable that the economic stability of global markets is immediately in jeopardy. We are talking about climate change. And when I speak about the immediate jeopardy of the economic stability globally, it sounds alarmist. It sounds alarmist. And we've heard a lot in the last 4 or 5 years. We've heard the term unprecedented so many times that it seems to have lost its meaning. I'm not going to say it because, frankly, it's not a surprise that we're here. It's unfortunate. It's not a surprise. We've known about these issues for a long time, and we've failed to address them as a global community, and now we are facing the repercussions of trying to put out the fire with a cup of water. Now, I'm not saying it isn't possible, but I'm saying it's a complicated challenge. And as global crises or climate crises cause disasters, we in the insurance community are facing different kinds of claims and how to address those claims. Now, when I break it down to you in terms of claims, we're into our comfort zone. This is a language we speak. The principles are comfortable: fortuity, liability, indemnity. And claims arising from climate change losses are really no different ultimately at the end of the day. We ask ourselves the questions, was the event that gave rise to the claim a fortuitous event? Was the risk insured? Was there an exclusion? Who's liable? Was it a corporation? Is a government involved? How are the claims evaluated? And importantly, is there subrogation? So today we're going to take a very brief survey of how climate change is altering the insurance landscape. We're going to discuss 3 areas broadly. And frankly, these issues are so complex, we're really going to scratch the surface on them. The first topic is the actual physical risk that's going on in the world right now. The second one is litigation, consequences in litigation. And then finally, transition risks. So I'm going to repeat that again because we're not using a PowerPoint presentation. This is a discussion group. Physical risk, consequences and liability, transition risks. So in our discussion today, excuse me, I'm joined by 3 internationally recognized experts. Toby Valance is a partner in the London office of DAC Beechcroft. He is the firm's climate change lead. His background is in marine, energy, and mining insurance claims and coverage disputes, and he acts for both insurers and reinsurers on losses across the globe. In the context of energy and mining liability claims, as well as the shift to renewables, Toby has developed an in-depth expertise on climate change risk, and he regularly advises his client on the broad implications of climate change for the insurance market. He's a regular author of articles on the subject, and he's contributed to reports prepared by ClimateWise Network, of which DAC Beechcroft is a member. Toby is a member of the London FOIL Executive and the FOIL London Marine Sector Focus Team. I'd like to introduce also Nigel Brooke from Clyde & Co. in the Clyde & Company office in London. Pertinent to our discussion, he advises on global insurance programs. He covers multinationals, which includes regulatory aspects, financial interest cover, and arrangements with captives. He drafts and advises on insurance and reinsurance wordings. He advises on economic and trade sanctions, which is very interesting considering what's going on in Europe. He is a member of the Law, Regulation, and Resilience Policies Working Group of the Insurance Development Forum. And that is a public-private partnership which seeks to optimize and extend the use of insurance and the industry's risk management capabilities to protect those most vulnerable to disasters. I'm going to repeat that because I'm not sure that actually is going to sink in with people. I said it kind of fast. The Law, Regulation, and Resilience Policy Working Group of the Insurance Development Forum. This is a public and private partnership seeking to optimize and extend the use of insurance and the industry's risk management capabilities. And they're doing that to protect the most vulnerable people and groups to the disasters. And he's involved, Toby's also involved in the development and exploration of risk transfer policies. in closing the global protection gap. He's authored several papers and reports on the rising tide of climate change, liability, and duties of care. I know I said a lot about Toby and Nigel, but believe me, that's just a fraction of the fascinating, interesting work they do. And I think it's worthwhile if you take the time and check out their bios on their firm websites. I'd also introduce my fellow CDL executive member, Heather Sanders. She's the principal at Sanderson Law in Calgary. She's nationally known for expertise on insurance coverage issue and is the author of 2 texts on the CGL and is the author of many articles, as many of you know. She is a skilled advocate and she's appeared at every level of court in Alberta and the Supreme Court of Canada. On the climate change front, she has helped guide insurers through the 2013 Calgary flood, the 2016 Fort McMurray wildfire, and the 2021 British Columbia Lower Mainland flooding. She's given many presentations on business interruption coverage, both in Canada and the United States, and very recently more so on climate change. She is the second vice president of Canadian Defence Lawyers, and actually she's vice president of Canadian Defence Lawyers, and is a director of the Federation of Defence and Corporate Counsel, the FDCC, and also former Canadian director to DRI. She's also a member of the American College of Coverage Counsel. Again, lots of information, but we have experts and we have to let the world know how lucky we are to have them here today. And I'm very proud and honored to welcome them. And without any further comment, I'm going to jump right into our questions, starting with physical risk. Heather, can you please give us some, maybe an overview of what's going on in Canada right now in terms of physical risk and claims?
Canada is impacted by climate change, as is every section of our of the globe. There is absolutely no doubt about it. Anyone who is resident in the Lower Mainland of British Columbia will never forget Remembrance Day weekend, November 2021, just a year ago, when it started to rain. And when British Columbia starts to complain about rain, you know that it's a problem. That event was beyond anyone's imagination. If you can imagine the city of Vancouver cut off, there was absolutely no land access to Vancouver because of rail washouts and landslides on the main highways. The Coquihalla Highway was just devastated. That's just an incredible event. And then moving east from British Columbia, we have wildfires throughout the interior of British Columbia, sparked by drought, which only magnifies the flood risk. And then we have, going into Alberta, we have flooding of 2013 of a magnitude that nobody could have predicted. And then we hit Manitoba, again, flooding through Lake Winnipeg, heading down into the United States. We've got tornadoes and convective storms in central Ontario, and then the Maritimes. My goodness, September 2022, a short few weeks ago, Fiona hit the Maritimes. There is no doubt that severe weather is impacting the economies of Canada, as is severe weather impacting the economies everywhere. AM Best is a American rating agency that rates the financial health of companies operating in the United States and frankly the world. And they published figures last week that the natural disasters is costing the global economies a total of US $343 billion. That is billion in 2021. And how does that compare? 343 billion 2021 compares to 2020's number of 297 billion. It's just an incredible number. Like, it's just beyond imagination. And if you got to understand that the 21st century average is a mere 74 billion. Like what we're talking about here is incredible. But what is really different about what's happening now compared to what happened earlier in the 21st century is that the P&C market is being buffeted by what the industry calls secondary perils. The industry is geared more or less to the primary perils of earthquake and hurricanes. And the secondary peril of weather-related natural catastrophe, severe storms, freezing, flooding, and that type of thing, is a new phenomenon because of the severity of these events. And for example, the lower mainland flooding of BC is considered a secondary risk. And Hurricane Fiona, being a hurricane, would be a primary risk. And it's these secondary perils, again, wildfires, tornadoes, severe convective storms, that are accounting for more than half of the global weather-related losses, with the remainder being the primary perils. And it's the reaction. And I'm going to explain this a little bit, because for those of us in the trenches, it's important to understand the battlefield, what's going on in the battlefield. We learned that in First World War. If those going over the wall don't understand what's going on, then we have chaos. So let me explain that to you for a little bit. The pressure of all these secondary events is pushing up these numbers into an incredible levels. And and in reaction to that, plus inflation, the reinsurers are currently moving to higher layers. They are tightening their terms and their conditions. And this is forcing the primary insurers, our clients, to tighten their wording, increase deductibles, and set sublimits for critical perils. And it all means that the Canadian P&C industry is going to have to somewhat change its approach to the insurability of natural disasters. Already, there's been outreach to government to partner on offering protection against flooding, and the federal public safety, Department of Public Safety has published a white paper on that, suggesting that they are.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I was going to interrupt. I'm sorry for interrupting. I want to bring it back to a question, because what I heard you say was that not only are we concerned with the primary risks, hurricanes and whatnot, as you said, as we phased out across our country, but it's the secondary ones that are creating most of the financial risks immediately. I'm wondering, with this huge influx of new claims, are we going to look at a long tailing period with these claims? Is there going to be an issue with claims based policies as opposed to occurrence? Can you comment on that?
Well, we'll get to that a little bit when we talk about what the literature and experts are calling the protection gap, how to deal with this financial risk. But property insurance is triggered by damage occurring in the policy period. So this is the here and now, as opposed to so yeah, this is the here and now. But there's something else I wanted to mention, and this is kind of cool, I think. In addition to partnering with government, there is a parametric insurance is coming to the fore. Parametric insurance has its origin in the derivatives market, and it's all about setting coverage for certain triggers, and the coverage is a predetermined financial amount. Company will pay you X dollars if a certain event occurs, and and this is not indemnity insurance. This is, we are going to pay you X dollars if a certain event occurs. And the event that is relevant to us could be rainfall over a certain level. Those with property in a certain postal code affected by that rainfall event would be paid a certain amount. Wind speed over a certain level, hail over a certain size, all determined by a third-party agency such as Environment Canada.
Okay.
And so that's a really cool development, I think, because now none of this is like, okay, I just need to say.
Yeah. Sorry, Heather. It's just that any one of these subjects we could go on for hours, if not days. And but I'd like to keep it a little bit more focused. And I certainly would like to hear what Nigel has to say about physical risks that are going on conjunctively or differently in the United Kingdom, Ireland, or in the world generally. Nigel?
Yeah, if I just look at it around the world, there's been so many vivid incidents in the last couple of years, just bringing home how different this is. It's hard to believe there are any climate deniers out there now. China has been breaking heat records for 100 days straight in large areas of the country. A third of Pakistan is underwater. Europe had a record summer, etc., etc., etc. The list goes on. I echo what Heather says, that the secondary perils are really coming to dominate. Wildfires, for example, which were very much a secondary peril for the insurance market 15 years ago, have really come to the fore. They're now multi-tens of billions events, particularly on the west coast of USA and Canada. And these have implications as well for what we'll be touching on later, which is climate liability, because these events are taking people by surprise. Buildings, for example, designed for one climate are being found out by another. There's areas of Texas, for example, which had biblical amounts of rain in Hurricane Harvey in 2017. They had 2 more rain events of a similar magnitude within 18 months. Each of them in some areas what was meant to be a 1 in 1,000-year event. So you're going to get architects and engineers and so on who'll get targeted saying, why the hell didn't you build my condo with that in mind? It's just an illustration of the principle with climate change that the past is simply no longer a good guide to the future.
Can I ask, when it comes to looking at these secondary perils, would these sorts of things also include business interruption in markets in different countries? And I say this with reference to the orchard, the agriculture industry in Pakistan, for instance, in Baluchistan, almost being completely eradicated, very tragically in the last year or two. Obviously, there are going to be purchasers, large companies that buy these products are not going to have them. Maybe they've got contracts in North America or in Europe and aren't able to supply. Can you comment on how these things are interconnected? Because sometimes we look at our computers and our keyboards all day long and we forget how interconnected we are.
That's it. And I think that's a really important point you just made. Although it's in reverse now, globalization, and we're going much more to autarky, but we are still at the moment very, very globally connected. And weather events in other thousands of miles away can have a direct impact on companies in the West. And we're finding this. You're quite right. There are coffee crops, for example, are being destroyed multiple years because the shift in the rainfall in a particular country. Coffee is particularly vulnerable to heat and to rain. As well as the crops as well becoming a lot less reliable. It's been really notable in a lot of regions. And this is leaving major food multinationals scrambling. How do they have a resilient supply chain that can fail over? And of course, everyone else is looking to fail over to similar parts of the world. So that this is going to become an increasing issue as climate change takes hold. And it's the unpredictability. We all know things are going to get worse until we stop putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere by the middle of this century, if all goes well. But we still don't know exactly in which ways it'll manifest itself and where. we've got a better and better idea, but there will still be some nasty surprises along the way. And we're going to have to do a lot to make the world more robust. For example, developing crops that are more resistant to heat and to intense rain and drought and so on.
I was wondering, Toby, I know that in our discussions before, we had talked about things and in terms of development of new technologies, as Nigel had just referred to. But there's lots of things we don't know. We are we're shooting darts at the dartboard, and it's moving, and we don't know where they're going to land. Can you maybe offer some insight as to what that actually looks like in terms of establishing or trying to advise our clients on these physical risks going forward?
That's a very difficult question to answer, Talal, because I don't have the answer to it. I know that working with clients, there is a big focus, and they're creating whole advisory teams, whole different sections of the business looking just at this, looking at how they can extract data to better understand what their potential exposure is. But as Nigel said, how can you try and predict the future on data that is constantly evolving? We relied on sort of regular patterns of weather and 100-year storms only happening every 100 years, and that has now shifted. So it is a real big concern. But the feeling is that data is key. Data is going to get us as close as we possibly can to understand how things have developed and evolved. And as part of that, we've been advising on an initiative to try and improve data sharing amongst carriers. There are various projects that are developing in different parts of the world. The EU are looking at it. The problem is data is seen as valuable. Well, it depends on what you do with the data that makes it valuable. But and there's also GDPR, which makes that difficult. But the feeling is, if we can better share as much loss data and risk data that's available between everyone, we might stand at least some chance of being able to sort of manage the transition that we're facing. But yeah, that would be my answer. But I'm afraid there isn't actually an answer, because it's still something that's being looked at and developed. And at the moment, the view is that everyone's a bit reluctant to share that data for the time being. Not least because things like the GDPR, and other countries have different, similar legislation, but just the fact that people want to hold on to their own data.
And I can see that referring back to what Nigel was saying in terms of the shift from globalization to autocracy, what we have now is we've got possibly seemingly the worst way to deal with the problems created or not addressed during globalization. I think that's probably the fairer way to say it. It wasn't globalization itself as so much as it was how it had progressed and the problems that came from it that probably could have been avoided. So now what we have is we've got these situations, and the reaction is, I don't want to face the world, so I'm going to hide under my blanket, which is essentially the way countries becoming isolationist in their foreign policy and in commercial policies. So that is a very interesting point, and it's unfortunate that the way to go forward is collaboration, and probably I think it goes without saying, and I know it's been a bad word in many jurisdictions in the last 5 or 6 years, greater, clearer regulation of markets and information. I think sounds to me like that is something that is absolutely needed in order to make sure that we get these physical risks, get a clear understanding of them. I'm now going to move on to, I see we've already sorry?
I'd just like to mention that for those of us who are handling claims day to day, like what can we expect out of all of this? We're going to be talking about the protection gap. That is the difference between what's covered and what's not covered. And that protection gap has been estimated to be only 38% is insured. And so we've got insureds who are looking to cover the difference between their actual loss and what's insured. And how do they do that? They these insureds are going to be pressing their bylaw coverage, their replacement cost. How do you replace property when the land that property is on has been eroded or frankly disappeared? They're going to be pressing their brokers. They're going to be pressing the consultants, E&Os, and all of this. And look at the municipalities who have to replace infrastructure because of all of these secondary perils and primary perils. So all of this, they're looking for money, and where's the money going to come from, and how are they going to do it? And that leads us to the transition risk.
Right. And just to make it clear, if not vivid, especially to the Canadians that are listening to this, protection gap. The number of people that had adequate insurance during Hurricane Ian on the East Coast is heartbreaking. There's no insurance for surge. So many of those homes and properties, people's life savings wiped out in the span of hours over the result of the surge from the hurricane. That is a very significant, excuse me, significant example, or a salient example of a protection gap. When we think about what's going on in our own homes and in our own communities, the question you should be asking yourself now is, what risks are we going to be facing in the future? And just to dovetail into our next subject, which is going to be actually, we're going to start talking about consequences in litigation. As Heather had just pointed out, what are the questions that are being asked of brokers? What kind of claims are going to be brought against brokers, agents? What's going into the policies? There's such a lag that and by way of example, there are several smaller regional insurance companies that may be writing agricultural type policies. And are those policies, those old, the wordings, I mean, how current are they? Are they on top of it? It's not good enough now just to have have something that's more stable, but the people in underwriting really need to be aware of all the risks that are going on, because there is a firestorm of litigation, and I'm sorry for the reference there. And so, climate litigation.
Sorry, Talal, just before we go on, just to pick up on Heather's point, I think another thing, as well as data sharing, is governments working with insurers and setting up funds. Talking about the protection gap.
Yeah.
Just, we over here, we have Floodbury, which is supposed to be phased out, I think, by the end of this decade, or even before the end of this decade. Sorry, Nigel, when is it?
Yes, it's 2038.
2038 of it. But even then, I'm intrigued to know how that might actually work out in practice, because it seems to me that the world has changed since Floodbury was first put in place. Flooding was increasing in this country, which is why it was established, just because of the lack of insurance. But the world has changed since then. And I think that for storm surge, for example, as you just talked about, Talal, it may require governments to stand alongside the insurance market to provide products for those who cannot afford them. Because unfortunately, there's a growing trend of uninsureds who simply can't afford things. And as Heather says, well, adding to what Heather was saying, these people are increasingly disgruntled and unhappy. It's leading to increased civil unrest in parts of the world, where people are feeling their world has got worse for nothing that they have done. They can't get insurance to recover from it, and someone is at fault. So it's,
Exactly.
And I would tie one thing into that. There's been a growing inequity in terms of taxation over the last 40 years. And, countries are having to think of new ways to raise revenue, or basically there's not going to be sufficient for us to have adequate funding for these things. Again, I don't want to get tied up into sort of, the global economic situation for the last 40 to 50 years, but these things are so integrated. And I think that's the point, or one of the main themes of our discussion today. Thank you, Toby, for pointing that out. So starting with on our next subject, which is climate litigation, Nigel, I was wondering if you could give us some insight as to when this started and how it has evolved over the past several years.
Sure, yeah. So climate litigation began in the 1980s, and it's gone in waves. And we've had, to date, cumulatively 2,000 cases, just over 2,000 cases. There's two big databases, one held, maintained in London, one in New York, which try to keep tabs on these. And we're well into the third wave now, which began around the time of the Paris Agreement in end of 2015. So in fact, well over half of those cases have been filed since then. And in fact, over a quarter have been filed since the beginning of 2020. So there's a real, as you said earlier, Talal, a real surge here. About 70% of cases are still against governments, but that 30% is a large figure in itself, the ones against companies, and now increasingly, small numbers, but increasingly against directors and officers. And we're also seeing evolution in the types of climate litigation. So historically, a lot of climate litigation was trying to hold governments to account, get them to move faster in cutting emissions, or in some cases to make their region more resilient against the impacts of climate change. And that's still going on. In fact, it's gone on to another level. One big case to watch is actually in the European Court of Human Rights. There's going to be a trial next March against 33 governments and trying to hold them to account and saying they've got to do more. And that illustrates one of the big trends, which is rights-based litigation. So this is duties of care rooted in fundamental rights, human rights, constitutional rights. And you had one of the big cases was Agenda against the Dutch government in finally decided at the end of 2019, Supreme Court, finding the Dutch government owed a duty of care to its citizens to cut emissions. They were ordered to cut emissions by 4% by the end of the following year, which they did in a scramble. In the last year or so, the German government was ordered to do better as well, and it did so within a week. With an election looming, they felt that was the right thing to do. And so this is a big phenomenon, and now we're seeing this moving into companies. So a lot of people will know that Shell were ordered by a Dutch court last year to cut their emissions by 45% by the end of this decade. That was, again, rights-based duty of care owed to the citizens of the Netherlands. That's under appeal. And there's similar cases against 3 of the big German auto manufacturers underway in Germany. We've got cases for damages. Most of those are in the USA, brought by municipalities against the oil majors, but there's also a couple in Europe. And in fact, the first to go to trial is likely to be one of the European ones against RWE, which is Europe's biggest utility. That's likely to go to trial in the next year or so. And that's being brought by a Peruvian farmer. It's a deliberate effort to really internationalize this litigation, trying to hold them accountable for their share of global emissions to date and the consequences of that in Peru. We've got greenwashing is now a bit of that's really taken off in various parts of the world. The hotspots, by the way, for litigation, for climate litigation, USA is always a hotspot, so that's just a given. Whatever the type of litigation, USA is there at number 1, certainly in terms of numbers. But in terms of novelty, Europe and Australia are punching well above their weight. Really interesting stuff coming out of there. And another phenomenon with this is that a lot of these cases, a lot of the most high-profile cases are being brought by activists. And they're bringing it on a strategic basis. They're trying to make a point, or trying to get an outcome anyway, which will drive change on a broader basis. They choose a target, but they're a kind of poster child for an industry, typically. That this is what will happen to the rest of you unless you clean up your act. And we're seeing a lot of that.
So
anyway, those are the main points.
Nigel, it seems to me that there's some things in terms of the expansion of how we think about law in particular, and I just want to touch on something a couple of things actually, but one thing in particular, which is to say standing. And standing has always been one of those things that we've held near and dear to us in common law jurisdictions as to who has the ability, the fitness to participate in litigation as a party. And it's an interesting situation. Standing is something that's being expanded by climate change litigation. And maybe it's something that I think as the law develops, is this also going to go into different areas of law, different areas of litigation, standing. And certainly from a constitutional perspective, in specifically in Canada, who has standing to bring constitutional challenges is law school 101 for us. Enforceability also was raised. I won't get into that. Enforceability of court orders and conflicts of laws issues. I'd like to come back to Australia, but first I think I'd like to go to Heather, if you can comment on the Blueberry River First Nation as by way of an example that's very close to home here.
Definitely. Climate change litigation is really being forced here by our First Nations. And for example, EcoJustice BC office, together with a West Coast First Nation, has brought a complaint in the Competition Bureau of Canada against Royal Bank of Canada. Royal Bank of Canada says that it's in the forefront of climate change and supporting the Paris Accord. This is all in their financial statements. And the complaint is, well, that's all fine and good, but you are the 5th largest global banker for fossil fuel industry. So how do you reconcile these? So the RBC is being investigated by the Competition Bureau. Greenwashing has come to Canada. And then Talal, to your point about the Blueberry First Nation. Blueberry First Nation is a First Nation that is a signatory to Treaty 8 in northeastern British Columbia, and it sued. This is just it's just a breach of contract action. It sued the province of British Columbia for violation of its treaty rights. But and the court found, trial level decision found that those rights were indeed violated by indiscriminate resource development impacting its traditional lands and the ability to live off the land. The BC government opted not to appeal this decision, and in fact is setting up funds to reclaim the land and repair the damage that's been done over the last 100 years. And copycat action has been filed by the Duncan First Nation in Alberta for the same relief against the Alberta government. Now, what's interesting in this is, are the governments going to just lie low and accept these judgments or contest them? And if they do contest them, are they going to bring contribution actions against those who were authorized and licensed to carry out these economic activities on the basis that it was foreseeable that their activities would endanger the treaty rights of these nations? So that's where the pressure is coming from in Canada, as I see it.
I definitely want to discuss about the interesting things that are happening in Australia, and I'll leave that to either Toby or Nigel to comment on, because I'm not sure, you're both experts, but I'm not sure if either of you has a particular interest in wanting to explain that.
To do so, Toby then perhaps chip in, but
oh no, I was going to say you go on this one. I've got a different point to make, and I know you've definitely got strong views on the situation going on in Australia.
Yeah, okay. So we've seen over there action against banks and pension funds saying you're not being transparent enough about a climate risk embedded in your business models. And one to watch there against Commonwealth Bank of Australia, there's the Abrahams Trust is bringing a repeat case against them, saying targeting 7 oil and gas exploration projects that they're allegedly funding, saying hand over documents, which is allowed under Australian law for shareholders. I want to find out just what your role is in this, and how can you then square that with your climate commitments, your net zero commitments. We've got a greenwashing case against Santos, who are a major player in natural gas. They said in their annual report last year that they were going to get to net zero by 2040, and they were going to they were selling their clean fuel. The clean fuel was natural gas, and their business plan showed they intend to carry on selling natural gas through 2040. And when you look at the small print, they square those propositions by saying they're going to arrange for all of the emissions from the natural gas to be captured at source. And the activists bringing the case are saying, well, that's magical thinking, that this hasn't been proved to work at scale and it's horrendously expensive. So how can you make these promises based on that untried technology? In another neck of the woods, the Australian government has been held liable to the nearby islanders for the effects of climate change, and it's the first damages award against a country for the consequences of climate change. It's a particularly hot spot because it's one of the largest coal exporters in the world, but it's also feeding climate change much more rapidly than most other parts of the world. And the land temperature there is surging. And we've seen some wild weather there in terms of heat waves and rain events. And it has got an activist community and a litigation community that punch way above their weight. Yeah, for a country of, I think, 25 million, they're right up there with the USA in terms of pugnaciousness in the courts.
Yeah, I just wanted to add just the development of activist litigation around the world. They're so sophisticated compared with what they used to be. I say this from a standpoint, and it's relevant to the Canadians on this call. My aunt lives on Vancouver Island, and she used to be a member of the Raging Grannies back in the 80s and 90s. And they were an early activist group concerned about environmental issues, particularly nuclear-powered ships and submarines in their harbours. But they used to just chain themselves to fences and get arrested. And, you know, it was the beginning point and it was an influence. But now they're not doing that. They are being very smart and they are looking at any possibility, rights issues. They're looking to stretch tortious law. That's what's happened in the Dutch courts. And so then trying to track how you think climate change litigation might develop around the world, particularly activist litigation, is hard to predict because it depends on how every different country's legal makeup is, if it's civil law or common law. And that's why I think Australia is an interesting one, because there's been a mix of cases out there, and New Zealand being common law jurisdictions, whereas the Uganda case in the Dutch courts and the claim faced by the German government, which is civil jurisdictions. And I think there's been a propensity, or there's a mixed position, which is why I wanted Nigel to go first, from the cases in New Zealand and Australia, for them to reject stretching tortious law. Now, there might be other scope, there might be other grounds for it, but certainly they're not going to go the direction of the Dutch courts. And it'll be interesting to see how the English courts approach this. And the UK government's been sued as well. They got sued earlier this year, judicial review, basically saying that their net zero targets and plan, while was not fit for purpose and won't be achieved. And the court, they were partially successfully activists in that claim. The court said, well, the targets are admirable, and if you hit the targets, then it's all good. But the problem is there's not enough substance to the plan. So the government's been told to go away and come back at the end of March next year and explain what that plan now is. But the prediction is that this will then precipitate claims against corporates in the UK, which then I wanted to bring on to is this concept of anchor defendants, which sort of falls alongside the climate change litigation because it's taking place in relation to environmental claims. So it's the situation where a subsidiary has caused harm in a developing part of the world. Generally, it's related to mining, harm to community, and it's whether that claim can actually be brought against the parent company, where they're based in the couple of claims that have happened over here in the UK. And I think that, again, looking at how activist groups are using law, that's from my perspective, is the really interesting point and slightly worrying point. So I guess it's a case of watch this space, but certainly in any jurisdiction you've got. And actually, I believe in Canada, there was one of these anchor defendant claims as well. I don't know as much about it, but I think it was to do with Nev Sun Resources. I believe a similar allowance was made by the Canadian courts. Basically said they would allow claimants to bring a claim against the parent company because the subsidiary basically doesn't have assets, or if they were going to fight the subsidiary, it'd be in the local jurisdiction where they wouldn't get a fair trial, wouldn't get access to justice.
So I'm sorry to interrupt, Toby, but
No.
This seems, again, going back to law school first principles of the fiction of piercing the corporate veil, as it were. I mean, it's analogous in the sense of, while we're not going after, we're not piercing the corporate veil, which is intellectually doesn't make any sense, but rather the courts, what you're saying is now because there aren't sufficient assets to satisfy judgments or anything like that, that what's happening now is that courts are saying, yes, fine, we won't call it piercing the corporate veil, but you can go to one of the owners directly that has assets. Is that kind of like what's going on?
I think it fits with the way that there's just been this massive groundswell in the last 5 years or so, a bit more now, around climate change litigation. There's just been a mindset change globally in judiciaries and generally society. It's just more accepted that people should be responsible for what they've undertaken. And hiding that beneath some corporate network of companies is no longer acceptable. So the courts just seem to be more willing to go, well, you profited from this, so now you've got to take responsibility for it. And obviously there's some legal arguments behind it, but the fact that the courts are thinking in that way, I think, comes more from a mindset change than really anything that's changed in legal principles.
It's interesting because what we see is, you know, if we look at law over the last say since the turn of the last century, the basis of our practice tended to be very much legal. And now what we do is, and I'm not going to blame Lord Denning entirely, but I mean, we see like I can't help it, but you know, the law school favorite, but there seems to be more of a willingness to enter into the world of equity and say, look, that's enough of this stuff. We're going to move away from the harshness of the law, and we're going to just try and come up with practical solutions, which absolutely has its perils. Heather, I was wondering if you could give us a quick comment before we go on to transitions, because I know we could talk all day about any of these subjects. Can you comment on that litigation where parent companies were being allowed to, or being tagged?
Well, I've been involved in some of these in the background, and I really can't comment.
Okay, I beg your pardon.
But what I'd like to do, if I could, look at these contribution lawsuits, contribution of fossil fuel companies to production of greenhouse gases, resulting in property damage at the municipal level, because there's the litigation that's going on in the States, looking for contribution is just, it's very concerning to insurers, because if any one of these actually goes to trial, and if contribution is found, then we're looking at triggering occurrence-based policies over the last, I don't know, since the Industrial Revolution, God, you know, since CGLs were invented in the 30s. So the massive economic fallout to insurers is quite remarkable, which you know, the city of Victoria in Canada passed a motion at the council level to urge the federation or I've forgotten the name of the organization, but it's the sort of the Federation of Municipalities in British Columbia, to bring a similar type of action, and that organization declined to do so. But it will happen. This protection gap that we mentioned earlier is so severe that they're going to be looking for money, and we're going to be seeing that type of contribution lawsuit. And
Right.
so that brings the whole issue of, are these is there a duty to defend these lawsuits? Because in the end, aren't we talking about a form of pollution? And is the absolute pollution exclusion that's been around since the 90s? Maybe that date's off, but it's certainly boilerplate GL wording. Is that strong enough to stand on to defeat a duty to defend these lawsuits?
Right.
Is greenhouse gas a pollutant? Well, it's carbon dioxide. You know, there's carbon dioxide around us today. It's not an irritant or contaminant in low quantities, but when you have these massive quantities, does it become a pollutant? Well, the Supreme Court of the United States said so.
Yeah, so I want to just touch on something that you were mentioning in terms of bringing in these other parties, and that is, and excuse me, the duty to defend and participation in the, or sorry, contribution lawsuits, referencing the recent Nelson case from British Columbia in terms of municipal protections. It seems to be a significant narrowing of that protection to municipalities in terms of what's policy and what is was in fact what is operational. It seems to me that there is significantly more risk for municipalities and insurers of municipalities based upon that recent decision. I don't know if you see it the same way as I do.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of legal defenses to the action. But from an insurance point of view, the question is, is there a duty to defend the darn thing?
Right.
And so that's sort of question number one in the insurers' minds.
Right.
And so, you know, the Hemlo decision out of the Ontario Court of Appeal was very clear that the pollution exclusion is there to exclude industrial pollution. Well, isn't this greenhouse gases
So
contribution? Industrial. Yeah. Anyways, all I'm saying is that there may be arguments right out of the box that occurrence-based insurers don't need to insure them, but
wow.
The situation is very different when it comes to contribution claims against consultants and architects and engineers.
So I would like to move right into our last area, which is transitional risks. We've been touching on it, such as greenwashing, et cetera. It's been a fascinating discussion so far. I had hoped that we would have even more time to get into this, which is why we saved it to the last, but I want to try and leave some time for some questions at the end. Transitional risks. Nigel, what are they?
Okay, in 2 minutes. It's so let's be clear what we're talking about. This is the transition to net zero, and of course that will be a matter of cutting emissions, making things more energy efficient as well, so that there's less energy consumption. It'll be the deployment of wind and solar and batteries. It'll be electric vehicles. It'll be greening hard-to-abate sectors like steel and cement and so on, which are much tougher nuts to crack. And the technology is very much at the formative stage. That needs to be scaled up and industrialized. Whereas wind and solar are now at that point. What we're going to get along the way, we're already getting, is tipping points, financial tipping points and economic tipping points. So wind and solar power generation have come down in price much faster than even the most optimistic were projecting 10 years ago. I mean, it's just astonishing the extent to which the price comes down for every doubling of capacity, the learning curve or Wright's law, and being demonstrated. Bigger and bigger word offshore wind turbines. The latest models are absolutely enormous. It's tipped base to tip, height of the Eiffel Tower, much more efficient, sweeping enormous areas. Blades 120 meters long. Solar is now, according to the IEA, the cheapest form of power generation in the world. But also, if you inflation, adjust for inflation, it's the cheapest form of power generation ever.
Wow.
And it's in 90% of the world, it's the cheapest form. It's cheaper than coal. There are parts of the world now where it would be cheaper to shut down an existing coal-fired power station and replace it with a new solar farm, because the cost of running that coal-fired power station would exceed the cost of building the solar farm. So this is steadily undermining business models. It's stranding trillions of dollars of assets tied up in the fossil fuel economy. And it's not just in the directly energy and power arenas. It's, for example, you think of all those production lines that are devoted to internal combustion engine vehicles, which are going to be closed down over the next 5 or 10 years. Again, electrification of vehicles has progressed much more rapidly than most motor companies were predicting, and they are scrambling now, spending tens of billions in a life or death gamble to get on board with this. And of course, all their heritage that goes with it. You know, your 100 years of heritage of designing really, really good internal combustion engines is worth nothing now. You are now a starter in a new game. And the figures, just worth bearing in mind, a third of fossil fuels are used for power generation. So just think of the transformation that's underway there, that demand that's going to get destroyed as more and more renewables are deployed for power generation. You've got the figures here. I think it's about 18% is for ground transportation for cars and light trucks and so on. That's going to get electrified, a lot of it. And a lot of countries are going to abolish no new internal combustion engines cars can be sold by somewhere in the 2030s.
Right.
This is going to make a profound change in demand, and it's going to strand even more assets.
So, I mean, there are examples of places in China where overnight there were no more motorcycles or motorized mopeds. They all had to go electrical. And now, if you see any videos or anything on the internet of those communities, traffic is quiet. You can hear a pin drop. It's very interesting.
It changes, and pollution levels are down as well.
Just drops
and of course,
right off.
And the surprise, of course, we've concentrated on electric four-wheel vehicles, but the quicker take-up, of course, has been two wheels. And again, London is transforming. All of the fast food delivery companies, they whiz past you silently now. And that's happened in the space of 2 years.
That's good news for our members who do personal injury work.
Yes.
Toby, it's something that we were talking about just the other day, which is something that we have to understand, that coming along with these, when I asked you that really, really hard question about, the crystal ball about the future in terms of risks, the reason why I actually asked you was because the other day we were discussing what is the right solution, what's the energy that's actually going into creating electrical vehicles versus used vehicles, and really the environmental impact of making transitions very quickly. Can you comment on what we know, what we don't know, and where those risks are, very briefly?
Yeah, I think the thing is, the difficulty is everyone's been put in this position sort of out of nowhere in a very short period of time. Suddenly everyone, governments, businesses have been asked to give complete different considerations. So as Nigel said, business models have gone out the window, but people are going to come up with the answers. Car manufacturers is a great example. The German car manufacturers are being sued. They've got to somehow achieve a target that is much sooner than they plan to. How do you achieve that? How do you go about that by and maintain profitability and keep your shareholders happy? Very, very difficult. And this is the transition risk in terms of how do businesses transition and hit these targets that they're expected to. And if they don't say on their websites what their targets are, they'll get in trouble. And then if they do put targets up there, they also might get in trouble because they've got to back them up. And that's where you get the whole greenwashing issue. Alternatively, you might get things similar to the VW scandal. That's quite a good example of what businesses under pressure do in order to make themselves an economically viable business and make themselves competitive. How do these businesses who are being forced down this route? And that's would be my sort of comment on this, is the transition has to be something that's balanced. We have the Stop Oil campaign over here. I don't know if that happens in Canada. They keep throwing paint at artwork and gluing themselves to things. But we can't just stop oil and gas. That's not something we can do without. There has to be this period of transition. And I think the insurance market has a fundamental role in that, in supporting the oil and gas industry and the automotive industry and everyone else who's going through this process to get to the right place where we need to be. But we have to do it in a staged and controlled manner.
Right. So when we talk about what that's supposed to be like, and again, our perspective of the world going to autocracy and countries not talking to each other on regulation, we can see how critical it is that everybody is on the same page when it comes to regulation and in these transitions.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's why COP27 at the moment, at least most people still are turning up to these things, but it has to be a coordinated effort. And what we were talking about, so an interesting point, a motor, okay, moving away from combustion to battery, but that might not be the solution, the final solution in terms of, batteries cause their own problems.
Especially in a marine environment.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, but it's not an option. I watched a YouTube video which showed that if we did put a battery on a commercial vessel, it would be so large that the vessel wouldn't be able to carry any cargo, or it would sink.
Unbelievable.
So the alternative, and there's lots of different fuel sources they're looking at, ammonia, etc. But green hydrogen seems to be the obvious one, what's getting the most focus, and that might become the answer for vehicles. So then we might go through this period of battery and then switch back to combustion, but using green hydrogen. So again, these businesses have to be supported through that period. And in the meantime, face off greenwashing claims and all the other litigation that they'll otherwise see. It's
Right.
not an easy period.
Heather, I was hoping
And
you
then
could comment on that and greenwashing as well.
Yes, because what we have here is exposure to the directors and officers of the companies that are involved, and to what extent, to the extent that these claims are requesting compensation for damages, then you've got a GL risk. But to the extent that there's an error or omission, then you're going to trigger perhaps a D&O policy, and the insurers are very concerned about that. But fortunately for the health of insurers, and unfortunate for directors, we are looking at largely claims-made coverage, which would confine the risk to one policy period. So this is going to come home to roost to all of us on our desk. We will get these claims, and in particular in the construction trades. When you look at these transition risks, let's take a really simple example. There's something called hurricane straps, basically metal straps that fasten the roof joists to the walls, give a house building more structural support. They are proven to be helpful in tornado, high wind situation to prevent death, injury, and retain the integrity of a building. They're not mandated by any building code in Canada. But given that there is knowledge of this very cheap, simple resource to make a building more resilient to climate change and these secondary perils that we've already talked about, is it negligent for a home builder, engineer, to build buildings, build homes, build developments without hurricane straps? And that's the kind of thing that we're talking about here as we transition. And it's there's all kinds of examples that are far more extensive than hurricane straps. But just think about the exposure to architects and engineers. But again, we're talking about a claims-made risk, an error or omission occurring in the policy period limited to that policy period, as opposed to the occurrence-based property damage of contribution claims.
I'd just like to add to that. I think that's absolutely valid. The D&O greenwashing claims are probably the hottest bit we're going to see in terms of direct impact of climate change litigation. That's the one that's really coming through. When I was talking about car manufacturers sort of cutting corners, or any manufacturer who's trying to fit, you might get product liability claims, issues coming out of that. But I think what Heather's been talking about, it's this, what I would probably phrase as consequential climate change litigation. So you're not being sued because you caused climate change, you're being sued because you failed to take account of climate change in the way you operate. And that fits in with foreseeability and remoteness in terms of, well, these things only happen every 100 years, so didn't have to take it into account. Well, that may not be an argument you can run anymore. And I think that's the one that is much harder to spot. And I think a lot of businesses out there go, well, I don't produce much in the way of emissions. And, so I'm not worried about, being sued because of my contribution to climate change, or greenwashing because I don't have to say too much about that. Well, what about how you operate? Have you considered, a colleague of mine said, has anything been talked about people's exposure to the sun, people who work outdoors, and the increases of skin cancers and other issues that relate to that? and then claims that they didn't give them protective clothing, etc. And I hadn't thought of it. Well, this is the thing. It's the things we're not thinking about are the biggest areas for concern. There's a case about baby rice, baby food with arsenic in rice. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it. Arsenic happens to grow when it grows. If it grows in drier, hotter climates, it absorbs more arsenic out of the soil because there's more arsenic in it, because it's more concentrated. It just happens to be a thing that rice does. And then there were issues and claims being brought in the US. Well, who could have thought of that, predicted that? But that is a reaction, a result of climate change, because rice is growing in hotter, drier conditions. So it's a big area.
So I touch on that. It's an interesting situation when we're looking at these older policies. We are contending on the insurance side, ever having to face the contra proferentum rule. And was there actually a meeting of the minds? Were the parties at item when those contracts were entered into? Did the insurer really understand what it was insuring? Did the party that was purchasing the insurance really understanding it was purchasing insurance for that reason? That's a very, very interesting thing. I don't know. I'm just pointing it out there that these are the sorts of things that might come up maybe in the defense. Who knows? I'd like to maybe ask members of our audience if they've got any questions in particular that they want to discuss. We've only got about 15 minutes left, unfortunately, and we'll try and do the best we can to have your questions answered. Excuse me. So, but in the meantime, while we're waiting for some of those questions to come in, it seems to me, based on what I've heard today, that Heather's reference to a different type of insurance policy, where that seems to be almost like, it's a bit like gambling, like straight gambling, which is to say, you give me $50 and these events happen and I'll give you odds 2-1, and that's it. I don't care. Heather?
Not quite. It's not quite. Munich Re is promoting parametric insurance for natural disasters, and as I understand their wording, I haven't seen it, but as I understand their wording, is that it's the coverage is for a predetermined amount, triggered by a certain event. So, for example, let's take an easier one: earthquake. You live in Vancouver, and you are in a postal code that where the seismic readings were 7.5. Your trigger is 7.5. Then you are entitled to a certain amount because you were affected by it. And then you have about 1,000 days after the payment to actually prove your loss. Now, so there is an indemnity to it, but what it does, as opposed to traditional insurance, is instead of under traditional insurance, you have to get a proof of loss in, and you have to, all of that. You get a payment made to your bank account right away, immediately. And with respect to municipalities, this is huge. Like when Hurricane Sandy hit New York, all the tunnels flooded, and it was imperative that those tunnels get drained. But the city of New York didn't have the cash to pay the contractors. And so parametric insurance, if it had been issued to the city of New York at the time, would have put cash into the city's hands immediately to get that crucial work done. Now, this is not going to substitute for traditional property insurance. It's going to be over and above. The question is whether or not insurers are going to take the gamble, because this is expensive coverage. And are they going to buy parametric and their property coverage? We'll see. But
yeah, Heather, just to pick up, you gave the hurricane example. The earthquake example. So Jumpstart Recovery, I think that's the one that Munich Re is now the
yes,
provider for. So they've been promoting this for some time before they finally found a carrier. And the way they promote it is interesting. That you can buy earthquake cover in California, but it's going to cost you a huge amount of money. And so there's a trade-off between the retention, how much of the risk you're prepared to bear yourself, and the premium you pay. And for a lot of people, that trade-off is just, it's invidious. What they offer a different bargain. It's not a substitute at all. It's a different kind of bargain, which to say, maybe you don't need that. Maybe you don't, or maybe you want to supplement it. Here instead is a policy which will pay you a flat $10,000. As long as you've got some sort of interest. It might be, for example, repair costs, or it might be moving out because you have to vacate the property for a week and you've got costs there. It doesn't matter what it is, some sort of interest, some sort of skin in the game. You just get $10,000 straight, and you get it within days of the earthquake. That's the other thing, because you don't have to wait for the loss adjuster to get around to you. And if that bargain works for you, buy this product. And I think it will find these niche use cases where it's by no means a straight replacement for conventional indemnity policy, but it might be something that's in a particular circumstance more affordable or more useful.
Munich Re talks about how parametric insurance has been a huge success in Africa for agricultural losses, where, you know, if it hasn't rained in 100 days, farmers get a payment into their bank accounts to buy seed and so on for the next season. And they tout that as a hallmark of the success of the product.
Yeah,
but
it's worth looking there at African Risk Capacity. ARC offers that to countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and it works on exactly that basis. They take parameters which are map the things that can go wrong with a crop. So drought of more than a certain amount, intense rainfall or heat of more than a certain amount. If you get enough of it and enough of these agreed points across the territory, then it pays out an agreed figure, and a country that can then use that to fund an intervention. So it's a brilliant bit of innovation, and it's really hard to think of how that can be made workable on a conventional indemnity basis, because within indemnity basis, you have to wait for the thing to go wrong, for the actual crops to fail. Then you send in your loss adjusters and ask, okay, how many crops have failed? By the time you get the payout, everyone's moved out, they're in refugee camps. This allows you to pay out and intervene and stop that happening.
Okay, so we have a question. This is just open to anyone. The question is, what changes to the CGL are ongoing, and what changes do you see coming forward in the standard CGL? Anyone?
I expect a tighter definition of pollutant.
Yeah.
I was just on that, say, we didn't get into the discussion, Heather, about what I was very interested to hear your comments about pollution does include industrial pollution. My view on that is that CO2 wouldn't fall in that definition, because it talks about something sudden, unexpected happening, or that's the buyback, as the option is. And it in my head, it's something more immediately harmful. That's what that pollution exclusion is directed at.
Yeah. There's all kinds, Toby. I just went right to the exclusions. I didn't talk about whether or not it's covered.
But I agree, that's why it needs to be tightened up, because it shouldn't. It's now gone wider. The other thing is whether climate change exclusions might start to appear in policies.
Yeah.
You know, is that the other alternative? If it's too much to factor in and it's something you really don't want to cover, but that's probably not the right thing, and that's probably not what people would want to see, but that is the alternative. If we can't work out the pollution exclusion, well, then make it clear by the alternative.
Just 2 quick points on that. There's a new case in the USA about the pollution exclusion and the application of climate change. It's Aloha Petroleum Against Natural Union Fire, started in August in Hawaii. And that's the qualified pollution exclusion, not the absolutes, that's going to get tested in that case. And what was the other point?
It's okay. We were talking.
Right. So there is an exclusion. There is now a market exclusion in London for climate change, but it's very narrow. It's only applies if the defendant is being sued for contribution to climate change, not for the other varieties of climate litigation we've spoken about today. I don't know how widely it's been taken up, but it is there, sitting on the table.
And just on that point about contribution, the question about attribution is a really interesting one in terms of the litigation that's ongoing. But the science is improving around it, and the case that Nigel mentioned, the RWE, the Peruvian farmer, that's looking specifically at that point, because this Peruvian farmer needs to improve the flood defenses in the village where he is, because there's a glacier that's melting quicker than it was before, and there's more glacial floods. So they need to have a £20 million flood defense put in for the town where he is, and he wants RWE to pay their proportion of it. And this is where it gets, for me, I mean, how you allocate that, how much they contribute, and therefore, but certainly the attribution science is developing. So it's something that is going to become a more regular target. So people will be able to identify, and it's something that we looked at COP27. I don't know how you allocate between the richer nations, how they should fund the developing nations who've suffered the consequence of climate change, who's going to pay the most, we started the Industrial Revolution, sorry about that, but who contributed to it more and over what time period? It's a very difficult subject.
Well, there's two questions of attribution that are going to be tested in that case. One is the percentage allocation that RWE picks up. That's what the plaintiff's saying. You're responsible for 0.47% of all man-made emissions to date, therefore you pay 0.47% of the loss. But the other aspect, and this is where the climate attribution science comes in strong, he's got to identify the link between the warming of the globe and the specific incidents in his valley. So he's got to demonstrate that that glacier is melting more rapidly than it would have done in a world without those emissions. And that's very much where the climate attribution science comes in.
So, but from looking at it at a relatively basic legal perspective, with joint and several liability, you're 0.04% responsible for a massive loss. You're on the hook 100% for those damages by operation of the various negligence acts as we have here in Ontario, and it's up to you to chase down the others and for contribution. So you can see how this litigation, even though you just sort of catch one party by the toe, how massive it could instantly become. Our court systems are underfunded. I think it's no secret. It is very difficult for civil actions to even be heard. Certainly, I am speaking locally in Southwest Ontario. Let alone, I mean, do we really even have the capacity in certain areas to handle this type of litigation in a timely fashion? We absolutely want to, avoid the situation, as Nigel, you're referring to, by the time the money is done or the money is through, everybody's in a refugee camp or worse, as it were. So those are the kinds of considerations that we have. We're getting kind of close to the end of our time. I was wondering if perhaps Toby, do you have any other further comment that you want to make? I know it's kind of like a ridiculous question to ask. I'm going to ask it from each of you, and I'm sorry, Toby, I put you on the spot for this. Ridiculous, 30 seconds, message.
I think it's looking out for what's not obvious rather than what's obvious around climate change, which is the most important thing, and for our insurer clients and for their customers, and trying to help support in that side. For me, that's the most important.
Nigel?
I echo that. Surprises, there will be a lot more surprises. I do think one of the distinguishing features of the 2020s will be the rise of climate litigation. I think it's beginning to feed off itself. And quite a few of these cases are seeing some success and some traction. And there are other factors driving this, including the change in the judiciary. So as a younger generation comes through with a different mindset, I think that'll accelerate the change of view about what is and isn't acceptable. Where do you draw the line between okay and negligent, for example? I think that's going to change quite rapidly.
Heather?
I am excited about the creativity of the climate change litigation, and to Nigel's point, it's going to push our law into a different direction. And I'm excited about the opportunity for the Defense Bar to rise to that level of creativity, to look beyond the four corners of our desk and think about these issues in a more creative way as we build our defenses to these claims. This is a period of opportunity amid a crisis.
Right. So just something that is evident to me through the course of our discussions over the past several weeks and months, and our meeting here today, the one thing that is absolutely crystal clear to me, and I'm so glad that Foil has joined CDL, and we are hopefully strengthening our partnership, developing our partnership, is that when we look at climate change related litigation, we are looking at a global picture. Everything is integrated. Nobody lives in a bubble. I don't think it was ever like that, but it's apparently so. And that's a take-home message I would like to give to everybody that's listening today, is to remember into your day-to-day lives how integrated you are with what's going on in the world. And the food that you eat, the clothes that you wear, the car that you drive has an immediate direct impact in somebody else's life on someplace else on the planet. And ultimately, we as individuals, the only true way we can deal with this crisis, and I would suggest, is individual and personal accountability for the choices that we make on a day-to-day basis. Everybody in this room is intelligent, and everybody in this room can make an intelligent choice. For final comments, if Heather, Toby, Nigel, if anyone wants to say anything, now's a good time.
I wish I'd listened to my aunt and the Raging Grannies sooner.
Well, Talal, maybe I could just step in here and just thank you particularly for facilitating a really wide-ranging discussion, but keeping it brilliantly on track and on time. That's a superb job. Thank you particularly to Heather, Toby and Nigel for their contributions to this. I hope everybody's got something out of this. It's a little bit difficult when you're online to know exactly how well things are being received, but we will produce a write-up of this event, and we'll circulate that to obviously Foil members and also CDL members as well. And sometime in the next couple of weeks, I don't think we've actually got a date for this yet, but Randy and I and probably Mary Ellen as well will get together and have a chat about what other events we could put on, because I'm absolutely certain that there is huge value in this level of international collaboration, obviously in the area of climate change, which respects no borders, but I'm sure there are other areas as well that we could have really useful and worthwhile events around. So thank you everybody for coming along. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yep, everybody gradually going. Thanks, Heather, Nigel. That was really, really, really interesting, and
Yeah,
I'd say a little bit scary, but a little bit.
I think that goes to territory.
Yeah, a little bit sort of encouraging as well. Some of the things that you were saying, particularly the price of renewable energy. That's got to be a
we didn't get onto this, but about the impact of the energy crisis in the Ukraine war, and it's complicated because, of course, there is in the short term, it's the spigots being turned back on again to make up for the shortfall of gas coming from Russia, coal-fired power generation being cranked up and so on. But longer term, I think this is going to just push the foot down more on the accelerator. There's going to be much more investment, because I think what's really come to the fore in the last year is energy security. And the idea of being held hostage by, say, Russia or Saudi or whoever. So people are saying, right, this is not going to happen again. We are going to become energy independent. We are going to have our own wind, our own solar, our own nuclear.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, thanks once again. See you soon.
All right.
Cheers. Bye.